April 1945. Kyūshū's air smelled of diesel and honeysuckle, a contradiction of war and spring. Down a narrow farm road outside Fukuoka, the Imperial Japanese Army 4th Tank Division advanced in dusty procession. 30 Type 3 Chi-Nus tanks groaning under their own weight, treads clattering over the bridges of the Chikugo River. From a distance, the column looked formidable, steel silhouettes framed by terraced hills. Up close, they revealed the exhaustion of an empire at its limits. Each Chi-Nus was the product of late desperation. The crews called them last sons, tanks born too late to reach the Pacific battlefields already consumed by fire. Painted in patchwork camouflage, the vehicles bore chalked slogans, "Defend the homeland," applied by students pressed into service at the Sagami Arsenal. The tanks were new, their paint barely cured, but the crews were not. Most men had trained on obsolete Type 97 Chiha models and were meeting the 75mm Type 3 gun for the first time. At 0930 hours, the column halted near Kurume airfield. The crews dismounted, sweat darkening khaki uniforms as officers unfolded maps across a wooden crate. Captain Tadashi Murakami, commander of the 2nd Company, pointed to the southern beaches of Kyūshū, Miyazaki, Ariake Bay, where intelligence predicted the enemy landings for Operation Ketsu-Go, the defense of the home islands. "The Americans will bring many Shermans," Murakami said. "We will destroy them before they reach the hills." No one mentioned the shortages. Each tank carried only 50 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition. There were enough fuel drums for a week of training, and behind every promise of destruction lay the unspoken reality that these machines existed to die buying time. At the same hour, 5,000 miles away in Whitehall, London, the Directorate of Tank Design convened a technical meeting. The war in Europe was nearly over. The question now was Japan. In a cramped room smelling of tobacco and oil paper, Major A.T. Gill, late of the Royal Armoured Corps, briefed representatives from the War Office and Ministry of Supply. "If our armoured divisions are dispatched east," he began, "they will meet nothing comparable to the Panther or Tiger. The Japanese armour we've examined, the Type 95, the Type 97, is thin as tin plate, yet intelligence notes a heavier vehicle, the Type 3 Chi-Nus, with 50mm on the glacis. It is still inadequate against the 17-pounder. On the table lay firing range charts compiled from ordnance tests at Lulworth. The QF 17-pounder could punch through 130mm of armour at 1,000 yards with standard APCBC, with the new APDS round, nearly 200mm. Against the Chi-Nus' mild steel plate, sloped only 56 degrees and 50mm thick, penetration would be guaranteed at any battle range. Gill's conclusion was terse. Should Fireflies or Challenger tanks be deployed to the Far East, all known Japanese armour is vulnerable to single-round penetration. Tactical caution, not gun performance, will determine losses. It was an engineer's understatement. On paper, the Sherman Firefly, with its 17-pounder gun, could one-shot every Japanese tank ever built. Back in Kyūshū, the Japanese crews rehearsed for an invasion that had not yet come. Along a ridgeline above Kurume, Lieutenant Kenji Kobayashi's tank manoeuvred through fields of barley, turret traversing sluggishly. The Chi-Nus gun, a long 75mm derived from the naval 8cm piece, spat dust as it fired practice rounds at wooden silhouettes painted to resemble Shermans. The shells splintered the targets easily, and the crews cheered, but the officers knew the truth. Those were soft pine boards, not rolled homogeneous armour. Inside the tank, heat reached 45 degrees Celsius. The loader, Private Fujimoto, wiped his face with an oil rag. "If we fight the Americans, how many will come?" he asked. Kobayashi answered without turning. "All of them." Rumours filled the barracks. Some said the Allies had a new gun that could pierce a tank from a mile away. Others claimed it was mounted on aircraft. The source was intercepted radio chatter. Allied tank units in Europe discussing Fireflies and 17-pounders. Few in the 4th Tank Division knew what those words meant, but they felt the weight of them. Japanese military intelligence had indeed noticed the weapon. Reports from the European desk of the Army General Staff summarized Allied tank developments based on Swiss and Swedish trade journals. British forces employ Sherman IC Firefly type with 76.2mm long barrel gun, capable of defeating Tiger Y at 1,500 meters, estimated armor penetration 150mm. If such vehicles appear in Pacific theater, all current types, Type 1 Chihei, Type 3 Chi-Nus, require ambush tactics. Colonel Sadao Uemura, chief of the armor section, annotated the margin with a single phrase, "Impossible to match." Production priorities were already collapsing under bombing and material shortage. Of the planned 500 Chi-Nus tanks, fewer than 170 were completed before August 1945, many without radios. Meanwhile, in the ruins of northern Germany, Fireflies rolled eastward through smoke and tulip fields. At Eindhoven, Sergeant Norman Jock Hutchins of the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry leaned against his tank's glacis, writing a letter home. The war's nearly done. They say we may go east next, fight the Japs. If we do, I pity their tanks. The old 17-pounders like a church organ. Press the pedal and something explodes at the other end. His tank, a Sherman IC hybrid, carried 78 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition, each capable of slicing through 5 inches of steel. Crews who had survived duels with Panthers considered any Japanese tank a target of opportunity, yet none would ever see one. The British Army of the Rhine would soon demobilize, and the Fireflies that might have been shipped to the Pacific remained in Europe until scrapped or sold. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters issued Directive No. 1028 on June 15, 1945, all armoured units to prepare for decisive battle on the homeland. The 4th Tank Division was to guard Kyūshū. The 5th would defend the Kanto Plain. Their tanks dug into earthen revetments, hulls camouflaged with branches, guns trained toward the sea. To the planners of Operation Ketsu-Go, the Chi-Nus represented a modern miracle. To Allied ordnance experts, it was already obsolete. The same week, Japanese crews practiced gunnery in rice paddies. British analysts at Shoeburyness compared penetration tests. The Firefly's 17-pounder against American and Japanese plates captured in the Philippines. At 800 yards, the APCBC round punched through 125 millimeters of armor at 30 degrees. The Japanese steel failed catastrophically, brittle fractures splitting entire plates. A typed note in the margin read simply, "Any contact will be fatal to enemy vehicle." For the men on Kyūshū, the enemy's power was an abstraction. They saw no Fireflies, only the contrails of B-29s and the distant thunder of naval bombardments. Yet each day intelligence officers read translated reports of the war in Europe, where Shermans with long guns shattered German heavy armour. The phrase, "British-type Sherman with special gun," circulated like rumour and prophecy. Lieutenant Kobayashi recorded in his diary, July 3rd, "They say the British tank can kill ours with one shot. If true, we must strike first. But the Americans will come from the sky before we see their tanks." Had the invasion occurred, the Fireflies would likely have landed with Commonwealth contingents, perhaps the British Pacific Fleet's 3rd Corps, scheduled for late 1945. Their arrival was preempted by Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and surrender. The two machines, the Chi-Nus and the Firefly, stood at opposite ends of a war that ended too abruptly for them to meet. In that stillborn battlefield lies the quiet irony of industrial destiny. Japan had built a tank to fight the Sherman. Britain had built a Sherman to fight the Tiger, and neither ever faced the other. Yet the men who trained in the rice fields of Kyūshū and the men who cleaned their 17-pounder barrels in the rain of northern Germany were linked by a mathematics neither could escape: power, velocity, and the certainty that steel meeting steel favoured the side with more of both. When the Emperor's voice crackled through the radio on August 15th, the tanks of the 4th Division remained lined in their earthen bays, engines silent. The Chi-Nus crews listened in disbelief as surrender was announced. Across an ocean of distance, Firefly crews stacked ammunition for transport home. The war that would have decided whose gun could kill in one shot never came. Yet in the archives of both nations, the penetration tables, the metallurgical reports, the answer was already written. Had they met, Japan's last sons would have died in their first hour, and Britain's Fireflies would have confirmed what Major Gill had told Whitehall months before. All known Japanese armour is vulnerable to single-round penetration. The shadows of Kyūshū lengthened over tanks that would never fire. History had spared them the demonstration. The Type 3 Chi-Nus was never meant to be a miracle. It was, at its core, an admission. Japan's belated recognition that the age of light tanks had passed and that the Empire's armoured forces were dangerously obsolete. Its name, Chi-Nus, literally meant Medium Tank Model 3. But to the engineers at the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries works at Nagoya, it represented something closer to desperation-made steel. The tank's genesis lay in 1943, when news from the Pacific began filtering back through censored channels. Reports from New Guinea, the Solomons and the Philippines described Japanese Type 95 Heigo and Type 97 Chiha tanks being destroyed en masse by American M3 Lees and M4 Shermans. Armour that had once been adequate against Chinese and Soviet light tanks proved paper-thin under the American 75mm gun. At Buna, a single Sherman platoon had annihilated a Japanese armoured company in minutes. For the first time, Japan's Army General Staff admitted it could not fight Allied armour with existing designs. In February 1943, the Army Technical Bureau convened its engineers to discuss an urgent replacement. Their first attempts, the Type 1 Chi-He and Type 2 Ho-I, were incremental, better armour, new suspension, but still inferior to the Sherman. Only the proposal for a heavier medium tank, armed with a new high-velocity 75mm gun, promised parity. The project received the designation Type 3, the year 2603 of the imperial calendar. The engineers faced the same constraints that defined Japan's entire war industry: scarcity of high-grade steel, chronic fuel shortages, and an overstretched supply chain. The decision was made to use existing Chi-He hulls as a base, welding thicker armour plates where possible, and installing the new Type 3 75mm L-38 gun, a weapon adapted from the Navy's 8cm anti-aircraft piece. On paper, it was Japan's answer to the Sherman. In practice, it was a patchwork compromise, an impressive achievement under siege conditions, but already outdated when the first prototype rolled out of Sagami Arsenal in mid-1944. The Chi-Nus specifications looked formidable compared to its predecessors. Armour thickness ranged from 20mm on the sides to 50mm on the glacis, angled modestly to improve deflection. The gun could fire a 6.6 kg armour-piercing shell at 680 meters per second, capable of penetrating roughly 90mm of vertical armour at 100 meters, enough to destroy an early M4 Sherman if the range and angle were favourable. It was Japan's first tank that, at least theoretically, could fight the Americans on something approaching equal terms. But by 1944, the Americans were already fielding Shermans with the 76mm M1A1 gun, while the British were upgunning their own with the 17-pounder, a weapon twice as powerful as Japan's best. The Chi-Nus entered existence already chasing a moving target. Even so, it was an extraordinary accomplishment within the collapsing industrial landscape of late-war Japan. Each Chi-Nus required over 10,000 man-hours to produce, most of it done by semi-skilled labour under air raid sirens. Aluminum, copper and rubber were rationed. Radio equipment was scarce, and testing grounds were repeatedly bombed. Many tanks left the factories unpainted or missing optical sights. Yet between 144 and 166 units were completed between late 1944 and August 1945, all assigned to the newly formed 4th Tank Division, headquartered in Fukuoka. That division, activated in June 1944, was Japan's last armoured reserve. Unlike earlier formations deployed to China or the Philippines, the 4th Division was intended for homeland defence. Its tanks never left the home islands. They trained for a single mission, repelling an invasion that everyone knew would come. Their crews studied the enemy obsessively. American manuals captured in the Philippines were translated and pored over. Crews memorized silhouettes of Sherman variants, learning to distinguish between short and long-barreled guns. Some officers speculated about new Allied supertanks, rumoured to mount guns of 76 or even 90mm calibre. No one yet knew that the British 17-pounder existed. Its name would not appear in Japanese intelligence summaries until the final months of the war. In the dry riverbeds near Kurume, Chi-Nus practised ambush tactics. The doctrine was clear. Let the Shermans approach within 300 metres, strike the side or rear, and retreat behind cover. Their commanders understood that frontal duels were suicide. The 50mm of armour that shielded their tanks could not withstand direct hits from American high-velocity guns. Instead, the Japanese planners envisioned a landscape turned into a labyrinth of traps, camouflaged hulls, overlapping fields of fire, and suicidal counterattacks supported by infantry with satchel charges. But behind the drills lay a quiet fatalism. Most crews knew the numbers. The Type 3 gun's armour-piercing round carried only half the kinetic energy of the American 76mm and less than one-third of the British 17-pounder. Against Allied ammunition made with hardened steel and advanced propellants, the Chi-Nus shells often shattered on impact during trials. Engineers worked feverishly to improve metallurgical quality, but by 1945, Japanese industry could barely produce reliable shell casings. Colonel Sadao Uemura summarized the dilemma in a confidential July 1945 memorandum to Imperial headquarters. The Type 3 medium tank equals the American M4 of 1942, but cannot resist the latest enemy models. The Firefly and 76mm Sherman surpass it entirely. Yet we have no alternative weapon. We will fight with what remains. When surrender came, the 4th Tank Division had never fired a shot in anger. Its Chi-Nus sat in earthen revetments overlooking the beaches of Kyūshū, engines drained of fuel, crews listening to the Emperor's broadcast with disbelief. In later interviews, surviving officers described a mixture of relief and humiliation, relief that they would live, humiliation that their creation would never be tested. The Type 3 Chi-Nu was thus a paradox, Japan's most advanced tank of the war, and also its most irrelevant. Designed to destroy Shermans, it never met one. Built to defend the homeland, it became a museum piece of a war that ended before it could begin. And across the sea, British and American planners quietly struck it from target lists, noting in post-war assessments that its armour would have offered no meaningful resistance to the 17-pounder gun. The duel for which it had been designed existed only in reports, firing tables, and the minds of men who trained for a battle that history never granted them. The British 17-pounder was born from fear of the tiger. In 1942, when reports from North Africa confirmed that German panzers could shrug off British 6-pounder shells at any reasonable range, the War Office demanded an answer that physics alone could supply: velocity. Out of the Royal Ordnance Factory at Woolwich came the Ordnance QF 17-pounder, a 76.2mm gun whose barrel was nearly 3 metres long and whose propellant charge produced a recoil so fierce it could lift the gun carriage off the ground. It was a weapon of extremes, heavy, loud, temperamental, but its first trials shattered 120mm of steel at 1,000 yards. Britain had found the instrument that would kill tigers. Yet designing a gun is simpler than delivering it to the front. By the time the 17-pounder was ready for service, the only tank that could carry it, the A-30 Challenger, was still months from production. The Sherman, America's reliable but undergunned workhorse, filled British armoured brigades in the meantime. Engineers at the Royal Armoured Corps Gunnery School proposed a solution so audacious it was nearly dismissed. Shoehorn the 17-pounder into a Sherman turret, even if it meant cutting metal and faith in equal measure. It took a single engineer, Major George Brighty, to prove it could be done. At Lulworth, he and his team physically rotated the 17-pounder breech 90 degrees sideways to fit under the turret roof. They removed the radio from the rear of the turret, bolted it into a new box welded onto the back of the hull, and replaced the coaxial machine gun with nothing. There was no room for one. The ammunition, longer than a man's forearm, had to be hand-loaded at an awkward angle. The Americans called it unsafe. The British called it necessary. The result was the Sherman Firefly, officially the Sherman Wind C, based on the M4, or VC, based on the M4A4. Externally, it was unmistakable. The long 17-pounder barrel extended like a spear far beyond the hull, counterweighted with a muzzle brake the size of a kettle drum. Inside, it was cramped, loud, and dangerous to operate, but lethally effective. The first Fireflies went into combat with the 21st Army Group in June 1944 on the hedgerow roads of Normandy. On June 8th, Sergeant Joe Ekins of the Northamptonshire Yeomanry destroyed 3 Tigers in 12 minutes near Saint-Aignan-de-Crémenil. German crews learned to fear the Firefly. Its muzzle flash was a beacon of death. By 1945, over 2,000 Fireflies roamed Western Europe. Their gun, firing the APCB CMK-8 round, could penetrate 130 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards, nearly twice the power of the American 76 millimeter. The rare APDS, armor-piercing discarding sabot ammunition, introduced late in the war, reached muzzle velocities above 1,200 meters per second, turning even the Tiger II's frontal armor into a potential target. In gunnery tests at Shoeburyness, British ordnance officers noted dryly, "All known enemy tanks vulnerable at all ranges under 2,000 yards." When planners began considering Operation Downfall, the projected invasion of Japan, these same officers attended early briefings with a quiet confidence. If the British Commonwealth sent armoured brigades to the Pacific, as proposed under Operation Coronet, they would bring Fireflies. The Japanese, it was assumed, had nothing that could withstand a 17-pounder. Intelligence summaries circulated in February 1945 recorded Japan's heaviest tank as the Type 3 Chi-Nus, with only 50 millimeters of frontal armor and a medium-velocity 75 millimeter gun. A single line in a War Office memo summed up British expectations. "Any 17-pounder equipped vehicle will destroy Japanese armor with one round at any reasonable range." The Firefly's effectiveness was not limited to brute penetration. British crews had mastered range estimation through number. 43 telescopic sights, calibrated in 100-yard increments. The gun could achieve first-shot hits at over 800 meters, ranges that Japanese doctrine did not even consider practical for tank engagements. The Firefly's shells could detonate internally, igniting ammunition racks or fuel lines with violent precision. Against lightly armoured targets like the Chi-Nus, the result would have been instantaneous destruction. Turret blown free, hull aflame, no survivors. Despite its fearsome reputation, the Firefly was never beloved. Crews cursed its slow turret traverse and the deafening concussion that shook loose fillings. Yet every troop commander wanted at least one in his section. In a standard British tank troop of 4 Shermans, one would be a Firefly, providing overwatch while the others advanced. The ratio was a pragmatic reflection of logistics. There were never enough 17-pounder barrels to arm them all. In Italy, Fireflies climbed the Apennines with the 8th Army, their long barrels scraping stone walls as they turned. In northwest Europe, they prowled the ruins of Arnhem and Bremen. A few were earmarked for the British Pacific Fleet's Third Corps, but the war ended before they could be shipped east. The Fireflies' legend, like the Chi-Nus' purpose, would remain confined to theory. When post-war analysts compared the two designs, the verdict was unequivocal. The 17-pounder's kinetic energy, 3.1 megajoules, dwarfed the Chi-Nus' 1.5, and its shell mass and propellant charge made even heavy German tanks vulnerable. Against the Japanese vehicle's 50mm plate, it was overkill. Firing trials conducted in 1946 using captured Japanese armour confirmed that the 17-pounder could penetrate the Chi-Nus' frontal glacis at over 2,000 metres, more than double the expected combat range in Kyūshū's broken terrain. The Firefly thus existed as both weapon and symbol, a triumph of improvisation that embodied Allied industrial superiority. Where Japan's engineers struggled to produce 100 tanks, Britain could upgun thousands. The Firefly's very existence underscored the imbalance between two industrial worlds, one building weapons by the ton, the other by the handful. In the hypothetical war that planners envisioned but history erased, the Firefly was destiny waiting to be enacted. It was the gun designed to kill tigers, but perfectly suited to annihilate Chi-Nus. The outcome was already written in the firing tables. If the Firefly had landed on Kyūshū's beaches, every Japanese tank would have been a one-shot story. In the summer of 1945, two steel destinies stood poised on opposite sides of the world, one under the blacked-out skylines of Japan, the other amid the blooming fields of northern Europe. Both were instruments of the same industrial war, yet geography and timing ensured they would never meet. The Sherman Firefly, built to hunt the tigers of Europe, and the Type 3 Chi-Nu, forged to repel the Shermans of America, were divided not by ideology or courage, but by the clock. By April, Europe was ending. The British 21st Army Group rolled across the Rhine in columns of tanks painted with victory dust. Their Fireflies, each marked by a long predatory barrel, had fulfilled their mission: destroy German armour and escort the infantry into the heart of the Reich. At the same moment, in Japan, the 4th Tank Division dug its Chi-Nus into the hillsides of Kyūshū, awaiting an invasion that seemed inevitable. Each crew was unaware of the other, yet linked in the strange symmetry of parallel wars converging toward the same August. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, British planners turned their gaze east. Within the War Office, a new directive circulated: preliminary preparations for the transfer of armoured forces to the Pacific Theatre under the codename Operation Downfall, the two-phase invasion of Japan. The first phase, Operation Olympic, called for an American-led landing on southern Kyūshū in November 1945. The second, Operation Coronet, scheduled for early 1946, envisioned a massive assault on Honshu's Kanto Plain, supported by Commonwealth divisions. The British Pacific Fleet was already assembling. The Royal Navy's carriers steamed toward Sydney. If the war continued, Fireflies would soon follow. Minutes from the Joint Planning Staff meeting of May 24, 1945, capture the expectations succinctly. Armoured elements, including 17-pounder Sherman tanks, will form part of the British Commonwealth Corps for Operation Coronet. Enemy tank resistance expected negligible, but 17-pounder will counter fortified positions and any heavy armour encountered. The planners had no illusions about the disparity. Japanese tank forces had been bled dry across the Pacific. Intelligence reports estimated fewer than 1,000 operational tanks remained on the home islands, most outdated. Yet intercepted radio messages hinted at a new medium tank, improved gun. That tank was the Chi-Nu, but its existence mattered little to the invasion timetable. The Allied assumption was that Japanese armour, whatever its type, could not survive a single 17-pounder hit. For Japan, meanwhile, the war had entered a defensive spiral. By mid-1945, the Imperial General Headquarters recognized that the nation could no longer project force outward. The strategy shifted to Ketsu-Go, decisive operation, the last stand upon Japanese soil. Every available tank, Chiha, Chihei, Chi-Nus, was assigned to coastal defense. The 4th Tank Division's 160 Chi-Nus were dispersed across Kyūshū in company-sized detachments, tasked with counterattacks once the enemy landed. Fuel reserves were rationed to a single sortie per tank. Their orders were fatalistic: fight until destroyed. The gulf between preparation and reality widened with each passing month. The Fireflies, victors of Europe, awaited shipment east, but were logistically stranded. Britain's shipping fleet was exhausted, the Suez Canal overloaded with troop transports. American naval planners hesitated to allocate deck space for Commonwealth tanks when US Shermans were already sufficient for the Pacific campaign. The 17-pounder ammunition, bulky and rare, required a separate supply chain incompatible with American ordnance depots. The paperwork of empire proved more decisive than gunfire. At the same time, American strategic air power rendered the question of tank duels almost moot. From June onward, B-29 superfortresses reduced Japan's industrial base to ash. The Sagami Arsenal, where Chi-Nus were assembled, was hit repeatedly. Power failures delayed the final production batches. By August, entire trainloads of tanks sat immobilized for lack of fuel. Even if the invasion had come, many would never have reached their assigned sectors. Still, on paper, both sides prepared. The Allied Land Forces Pacific, ALFSEA, mapped landing zones, drawing red circles around Miyazaki, Ariake Bay and Kushikino. Japanese officers drew the same circles on their own maps, filling them with symbols for armoured counterattack battalions. Historians later noted the eerie overlap. Allied intelligence had predicted exactly where Japan would deploy its tanks, down to the regimental level. The war's final irony was that both armies planned meticulously for a battle neither would fight. Then came the events that erased the battlefield before it formed. On August 6th, Hiroshima vanished in a flash of white light. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. That same week, the Soviet Union entered the war, smashing the Kwantung Army in Manchuria, Japan's last reserve of experienced soldiers. By August 15th, the Emperor's voice broke the radio silence of the home islands. The order was surrender. The tanks stayed in their pits. The Fireflies never boarded ships. Commonwealth divisions slated for Operation Coronet were disbanded or reassigned to occupation duty. A few Fireflies reached India and Ceylon in 1946, too late for war, serving instead as training vehicles in tropical heat. The Chi-Nus remained in Kyūshū, their crews instructed to drain fuel and remove breech blocks. American occupation forces later found them lined neatly in camouflaged shelters, barrels rusting, engines cold. None had fired a shot. When Allied intelligence teams examined the captured Chi-Nus, their reports confirmed what the ordnance experts had predicted months earlier. The 50mm frontal armour could be pierced at over 2,000 yards by the 17-pounder, and even the older American 76mm gun could achieve penetration at 800. Inferior in all respects, concluded a U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey technical report in December 1945. The duel was settled without combat. The absence of battle did not diminish its meaning. The Firefly and the Chi-Nus became relics of two nations' final gambles, proof that the war's outcome was already determined not by tactics, but by time. Japan had built tanks to fight a war it could no longer supply. Britain had built guns for enemies already defeated. Between them lay an ocean and a few short weeks that would forever separate the possible from the actual. In the end, the tanks never faced each other because history moved faster than steel could travel. The Fireflies stayed in Europe, their barrels pointed east toward a war that ended without them. The Chi-Nus waited in silence beneath the mountains of Kyūshū, ready for a battle that would never come. Both were monuments to preparation and to futility, a testament that sometimes the most decisive victories occur in the space between intent and event. War has many languages: strategy, courage, sacrifice. But by 1945, its truest dialect was mathematics. The duel between Britain's Sherman Firefly and Japan's Type 3 Chi-Nus, though never fought, can be spoken fluently in the numbers of velocity, armour and energy. When planners and ordnance officers ran their tables in the spring of that year, the results were not speculation. They were prophecy. The Firefly's 17-pounder, formerly the Ordnance QF-17 PDR Mark IV, fired a 7.7 kilogram armor-piercing ballistic-capped APC-BC projectile at 884 meters per second. With the newer APDS, armor-piercing discarding sabot round, velocity exceeded 1,200 meters per second, giving the shot more than 3.1 megajoules of muzzle energy, roughly equivalent to dropping a 1-ton truck from a 10-story building. At 1,000 yards, standard AP ammunition could defeat 130 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor, RHA, at 30 degrees from vertical. The APDS round, when stable, pushed that figure beyond 170 millimeters. It was a gun conceived to pierce the glacis of a tiger, not the mild steel plates of a mid-weight Japanese tank. The Type 3 Chi-Nus, in contrast, represented the outer limit of Japan's material capacity. Its 75mm Type 3 gun fired a 6.6 kilogram projectile at 680 meters per second, giving just 1.5 megajoules of energy. Tests at the Sagami Arsenal in late 1944 recorded penetration of 70 to 80 millimeters of armor at 100 meters, falling to 55 millimeters at 100 meters, 500 meters. Against an early M4 Sherman's 50mm frontal plate, it might succeed at close range. Against the Firefly's up-armored glacis of 63 millimeters at 47 degrees, it would fail unless point-blank and square-on. In the calculus of steel, the Chi-Nus was a knife at a gunfight. British analysts of the Directorate of Tank Design performed the same arithmetic when evaluating Japanese armour intelligence. In a March 1945 summary titled Japanese Armoured Fighting Vehicles, Home Islands Defence, the note reads, enemy medium tanks, Type 3, reported 50mm front, 25mm side, mild steel or poor alloy. 17-pounder estimated to penetrate at all ranges. Probability of catastrophic detonation upon impact nearly certain. The mathematics bore this out. A 17-pounder APC-BC round striking the Chi-Nus glacis at 800 meters would carry nearly twice the energy needed to perforate the plate and would retain sufficient velocity to ignite the fuel tanks behind it. The first shot would almost certainly destroy the target, what gunners called a one-round kill. Japanese records confirm their own grim awareness. Ballistic trials conducted at Kurume Naval Arsenal in July 1945 tested the Chi-Nus armour against captured American 75mm rounds. The result? Complete penetration at 700 meters. The officer's marginal note was terse. If heavier guns appear, defensive measures none. The numbers also told a story of philosophy. Western design had evolved toward the principle of overmatch, firepower that exceeded any conceivable defense. Japanese engineers, constrained by industry and terrain, favored mobility and ambush. The Chi-Nus was meant to hide, strike from 300 meters or less, and vanish behind ridgelines. But the geography of Kyūshū, open paddies, narrow valleys, offered few such sanctuaries. Against Fireflies operating in hull-down positions, the Chi-Nus 75mm would need to close within pistol range to penetrate, while the British gun could kill from over 2 kilometers away. Consider a theoretical engagement at Ariake Bay, one of the projected invasion beaches. A troop of 4 Fireflies, advancing with infantry support, detects a Chi-Nus platoon at 1,200 meters. The British commander orders his tanks to halt, range and fire. The first salvo, 4 17-pounder shells, crosses the distance in 1.3 seconds, Each strikes with 2,800 kilojoules of energy. The thin armour of the Japanese tanks offers no resistance. Turrets lift, hulls ignite. Return fire arrives too late. Statistically, every Firefly survives. Every Chi-Nus is destroyed. This was not conjecture, it was engineering certainty. Yet the Chi-Nus gun was not wholly without merit. In static defence, its high-explosive shell could devastate landing craft, soft-skinned vehicles, or infantry concentrations. Japanese planners envisioned using tanks as mobile artillery, firing indirectly from reverse slopes until their ammunition or fuel was gone. In such a role, the Chi-Nus' lack of armour mattered less than its ability to shoot repeatedly. But against armour, its fate was sealed by chemistry. The nitrocellulose propellant used in Japan produced lower pressures than the cordite and nitroglycerin blends of Allied shells, limiting muzzle velocity. Even if Japanese metallurgists could have improved the shell design, the nation simply lacked the high-grade steel and propellant quality to compete. Post-war ballistic testing confirmed every calculation. In 1946, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department at Aberdeen Proving Ground fired 17-pounder rounds at captured Japanese armour plates. At 1,800 yards, full penetration was achieved with room to spare. Japanese tanks, the report concluded, offer no resistance to modern anti-tank weapons. Effective range, unlimited. But the duel of numbers reveals more than technological disparity. It exposes the industrial logic that defined victory. The Firefly's ammunition production in 1945 exceeded 2 million rounds. Japan produced fewer than 10,000 75mm anti-tank shells for the Chi-Nus. Even had the tanks met, Britain and the United States could replace their losses in days. Japan could not replace even one destroyed vehicle without weeks of labour and fuel that no longer existed. Thus, the confrontation between the Firefly and the Chi-Nus exists only on paper, yet its outcome is undeniable. The 17-pounder's equations erased the Chi-Nus before a trigger was ever pulled. In every column of figures, armour thickness, penetration, velocity, the British gun dominated by margins so vast that tactics became irrelevant. Had they met on the beaches of Kyūshū, the first shot of the first Firefly would have ended the duel, and perhaps the illusion of parity itself. The rest would have been silence, broken only by the arithmetic of war fulfilled. One round, one tank, one conclusion already written in steel and numbers. In the waning light of 1945, the Type 3 Chi-Nus represented both Japan's ambition and its exhaustion, a machine born too late from materials too poor for a war already lost. By the time the first production models rolled out of the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries Nagoya plant in January 1945, the tide had already swept past the home islands. American submarines prowled every shipping lane. Factories sputtered under blackout and bombardment. Yet the Imperial Army persisted, clinging to the belief that Japan could still meet the invader with armour, fire, and the spirit of Ketsu-Go. The Chi-Nus was the last expression of that faith. Its design lineage traced back to the Type 97 Chi-Ha, the workhorse of earlier campaigns in China and the Pacific. Where the Chi-Ha had once sufficed against lightly armoured foes, it was now hopelessly obsolete. Reports from Saipan and Leyte in 1944 had been brutal reading for Tokyo. Dozens of Chi-Has and Chi-Hei tanks annihilated by American Shermans, bazookas, and naval gunfire. A new tank was demanded, one that could at least threaten an M4 in frontal combat. The result was the Chi-Nus, heavier, longer, and armed with a 75mm gun adapted from the Type 90 field cannon. On paper, it matched the specifications of a 1942 medium tank. In reality, it was a stopgap, constructed in workshops stripped of copper and lubricants. When the 4th Tank Division received its first Chi-Nus in March 1945, the Island War had turned homeward. The division, under Lieutenant General Tsuchiya Shizuya, established its headquarters near Fukuoka and dispersed its companies throughout Kyūshū. Each regiment dug elaborate concealments, revetted pits and camouflaged sheds intended to protect the tanks from aerial reconnaissance. Their mission was simple: survive until the invasion. Every crew understood that there would be no retreat, no resupply, and no reinforcements. Training records from the IJA 4th Tank Regiment, recovered after the war, reveal the mood of those final months. Crews drilled manoeuvres at dawn to conserve fuel, running engines for only minutes at a time. Ammunition was counted shell by shell. Most tanks carried 10 armour-piercing and 30 high-explosive rounds, all precious. The division had been allocated just enough gasoline for one combat sortie per vehicle, roughly 50 kilometres of movement. Once committed to battle, each Chi-Nus was expected to fight until it could no longer move, then serve as a pillbox. The tankers themselves were veterans of distant fronts: Burma, Manchuria, China, men who had seen victory turn to ashes. Sergeant Kiyoshi Takeda, whose diary was discovered near Beppu in 1946, wrote in June 1945, "They tell us our tanks can stop the enemy if we aim for the sides. But the new American guns will surely burn us before we reach that range. We are told to stay hidden, to strike when they land. I will do my duty, but I think of the fire that comes from the sky and wonder if any of us will even see the enemy's face." The fire he feared had already come. From April to July, Task Force 58 struck the Japanese homeland relentlessly. Fukuoka's airfields burned, transportation networks disintegrated. Chi-Nus in transit were destroyed before they ever reached their deployment zones. Allied aerial reconnaissance photographs from May 1945 show camouflaged tank revetments along the coastal plain, targets marked for B-29 incendiary raids. In some units, the tanks were buried up to their turrets, transforming them into fixed guns. Even at full strength, Japan's armoured force was pitifully small. The Imperial Army Technical Bureau reported a total of 166 operational Chi-Nus by July 1945, scattered among 3 divisions. Many lacked radios, others used wooden mock barrels to conceal shortages of actual armament. The engines, derived from the Type 100 air-cooled diesel, were reliable but underpowered, pushing the 19-ton vehicle at barely 38 kilometers per hour on roads. The steel used in later production runs was of such low quality that plates sometimes warped during welding. Yet within the Army's desperate logic, the Chi-Nus served a purpose beyond its specifications. It was a symbol of continued resistance, a message to soldiers and civilians alike that Japan still possessed modern weapons to defend its soil. Propaganda posters printed in Osaka in May 1945 depicted Chi-Nus cresting a ridge under the slogan, "Steel hearts defend the Emperor's land." Reality was harsher. When Allied forces surveyed Kyūshū after the surrender, they found many of those steel hearts immobilized, half-assembled or cannibalized for parts. Despite their limitations, the Chi-Nus represented Japan's most capable tank of the war, arguably the only one that could have threatened early war Allied armour under ideal conditions. Its 75mm gun was accurate and stable, and the crew layout was finally comparable to Western standards, with a 5-man team and a rotating turret basket. Had the Chi-Nus appeared in 1942, it might have altered the course of the Pacific's early campaigns. In 1945, it was a relic of ambition colliding with collapse. After the surrender, occupation engineers conducted detailed studies of the surviving vehicles. The U.S. Army Technical Intelligence Bulletin No. 29, 1946, summarized the verdict succinctly. Type 3 Chi-Nus represents a commendable attempt at modernization within severe material constraints. Firepower inferior to contemporary Allied designs. Armor inadequate. Overall rating obsolescent. The surviving tanks, perhaps 50 in total, were transported to depots at Sasebo and Chiba. Some were scrapped, others served briefly in the newly formed Japanese National Police Reserve in the early 1950s before being melted down. Only one Chi-Nus survives today, preserved at the JGSDF Ordnance School in Tsuchiura. Its olive paint is faded, its gun sealed with a plug of rust, but its presence speaks volumes. It stands as the Empire's final armour, a monument to engineers who fought against scarcity and to soldiers who prepared for a battle that never came. The Chi-Nu was not a failure of design so much as a casualty of circumstance, a weapon conceived in isolation, destined never to test its purpose. It waited beneath the pines of Kyūshū while the world changed above it, proof that even in defeat Japan sought to meet steel with steel, no matter how hopeless the arithmetic had become. While Japan's tank crews rehearsed for annihilation on Kyūshū, the men who would have fought them were packing crates in Europe. Across the depots of Antwerp, Marseille and Taranto, Commonwealth armoured regiments stood at the edge of a war that refused to end. The Fireflies, sleek, long-barreled veterans of Normandy and the Rhine, were being overhauled, repainted and prepared for shipment to the Far East. Their destination, the beaches of Japan. The idea of a British-led contingent in Operation Downfall had first taken shape in February 1945. Churchill insisted that the United Kingdom and the Dominions must share in Japan's defeat. By May, the plan had solidified into the British Commonwealth Occupation and Invasion Force, later renamed the British Commonwealth Corps, BCC. It would include Australian, Canadian and British divisions, perhaps New Zealanders too, supported by armour. The 17-pounder Firefly was the Corps' spearhead, its symbol of technological parity with the Americans. At Aldershot, crews of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry and the 13th 18th Royal Hussars received Pacific briefings. Gunnery instructors emphasised the Firefly's accuracy at range, but cautioned against tropical conditions. The 17-pounder's recoil system, designed for temperate Europe, would require recalibration in the heat and humidity of the Pacific. "We will be fighting in jungle and paddy," read one training circular. "Visibility will be short, but the enemy tanks are few." Fire discipline must be absolute. The officers had no idea that in Japan the enemy was digging tank traps with bamboo shovels. In Italy, where the 8th Army was winding down its campaign, tank crews stripped spare parts from disabled vehicles. "They told us we were going to fight samurai next," recalled Corporal Peter Cook of the 4th County of London Yeomanry in a 1985 veterans reunion. "We laughed. Then they showed us the intelligence photos, Japanese tanks in the hills, dug in like pillboxes. We stopped laughing. To many of these men, the Pacific sounded like another lifetime away, yet the Firefly's presence there seemed inevitable. The Empire's tanks, like its soldiers, went where the war went. Logistical planners faced the arithmetic of distance. Each Firefly weighed 34 tons. Each required specialised ammunition, maintenance tools and transport ships that were already in short supply. The War Office Transportation Branch calculated that shipping even one armoured brigade to the Pacific would consume 1.5% of Britain's remaining merchant tonnage. Still, preparations continued. At the Royal Ordnance Factory, Woolwich, 17-pounder shells were being packed into tropical-proof containers, shellac-sealed boxes stamped "Pacific Use Only." In Ceylon and Australia, workshops were cleared to receive the new tanks. Commonwealth strategists debated where their Fireflies would fight. Some argued for a supporting role in Operation Olympic, the first assault on Kyūshū. Others wanted them held for Operation Coronet, the invasion of Honshu near Tokyo. A memo dated June 3, 1945, from the Joint Planning Staff to the Admiralty concluded, "Due to limited Japanese armoured potential, primary employment of 17-pounder Shermans will be in counter-fortification and anti-bunker operations. The weapon's armour penetration exceeds any known Japanese defences." Translated from bureaucratic language, this meant the Firefly would have nothing worthy to shoot at. The 17-pounder, conceived to kill tigers, was being sent to destroy concrete. Yet the tankers trained regardless, convinced that Japan's resistance would be ferocious. News of Okinawa, 110,000 Japanese dead, reinforced their expectation that the invasion of the home islands would be worse. The Fireflies themselves were in fine condition. The VC variant, built on the M4A4 chassis, featured the long Chrysler multi-bank engine and an extended hull ideal for Pacific service. Many had been refitted with deep wading gear and tropical air filters, tested in mock landings along the Devon coast. The tank's olive-drab paint was overcoated with a dull khaki green designed to blend with coastal grass rather than European hedgerows. Mechanics joked that they looked sunburned. Crews painted kangaroos, maple leaves, and rising suns impaled by Union Jacks on the turrets. Despite the optimism, morale was mixed. Europe was free, men longed for home, and rumours swirled that the atomic bomb, whatever it was, might end the war before the invasion began. Letters from these regiments survive in the Imperial War Museum archives, written between June and August 1945. One trooper wrote, "They say our next job is in Japan. I can't imagine fighting a tank there. Probably jungle, rice fields, rain. Still, if the Firefly can kill a tiger, it can kill anything." Another added wryly, "Perhaps by the time we arrive, there'll be no one left to fight." He was right. The Fireflies never left Europe. On August 6th, Hiroshima vanished, and 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. When Japan surrendered, loading orders were cancelled overnight. The tanks stayed parked in marshalling yards, their hulls covered with tarpaulins. Some were sold to the Dutch and Belgians, others became museum pieces. A few were loaded after all, not for war, but for occupation duty in Hong Kong and Singapore, where their long guns pointed at nothing but harbour skies. In post-war interviews, British officers often mused on the irony of it. "We built the perfect tank killer," said Colonel John Cameron of the Royal Armoured Corps in 1947, "and then ran out of tanks to kill." Yet in the quiet arithmetic of hindsight, those idle Fireflies embodied the war's final mercy. They had been designed to meet the enemy in battle, but history spared them that task. The duel that would have set British steel against Japanese resolve never occurred, not because of failure, but because the war ended too soon for even the most perfect weapon to find its purpose. And so the Fireflies waited, engines silent, on European docks while a new age dawned, a world where wars would be decided not by armour and velocity, but by the flash of a single bomb. At dawn on August 6, 1945, the skies over Hiroshima were the calmest they had been in weeks. Civilians sweeping rubble from air raid clearings paused to watch a solitary B-29 high above the haze, an unarmed reconnaissance flight, they assumed. In its bomb bay, Little Boy ticked toward detonation. Within 43 seconds, the world that the Chi-Nus had been built to defend no longer existed. The logic of armour, forged in the furnaces of Europe, died in that flash of light. The Firefly's long 17-pounder barrel, the Chi-Nus' last hope of defiance, both became irrelevant in a war that had leapt from steel to sunfire. For decades afterward, ordnance historians would describe that morning as the moment kinetic warfare met its singularity. It was not that tanks had ceased to matter, but that no tank could matter in the shadow of atomic physics. In Tokyo, the first reports were incomprehensible. "Entire city destroyed by new weapon," read the intercept from the Imperial General Headquarters Liaison Office in Hiroshima. General Anami, Minister of War, demanded confirmation. None came. There was nothing left to report from. Within 3 days, Nagasaki followed. Where the Firefly would have duelled the Chi-Nus, where Commonwealth and Imperial tankers would have measured each other through smoke and rain, there was now only absence, streets erased, armour reduced to molecules. At Fukuoka, the 4th Tank Division's Chi-Nus crews listened to the Emperor's voice on August 15th. They were standing beside their buried tanks, engines cold, waiting for the order to move south to Kagoshima to resist the expected landings. The broadcast came through static and tears. "Endure the unendurable." Some bowed. Others smashed their sidearms. A few, refusing to believe, sat inside their tanks until the fuel evaporated and rust began its slow, inevitable victory. In Britain, the Firefly crews received the news with disbelief and relief in equal measure. Sergeant Peter Cook of the 13th 18th Hussars wrote in his diary, "The war is over, not by invasion, but by annihilation." The docks at Southampton that had been filled with crates of 17-pounder ammunition fell silent. Mechanics locked their workshops. Crews drifted toward demobilization lines. For them, the end was strangely anticlimactic. They had prepared for months to face an enemy who no longer existed. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, dispatched to Japan immediately after the surrender, catalogued the devastation with bureaucratic precision. Among the ruins of Osaka and Nagoya, inspectors found the remains of tank factories, assembly jigs twisted into modern art. At Sagami Arsenal, where Chi-Nus had once been welded, the steel presses were melted into puddles. The survey's engineers noted that atomic attack rendered ground defence obsolete within radius of 15 kilometres. In such an environment, tanks were meaningless. The very concept of armour had been transcended by temperature. Yet within the military archives, the paperwork of invasion remained. Maps, gunnery charts, logistical manifests, every contour of the battle that never came. They reveal a haunting symmetry. At Miyazaki, on Kyūshū's eastern shore, Allied planners had designated landing zones codenamed Austin, Baker and Charlie. Opposite those same beaches, the Japanese had positioned the 4th Tank Division's 2nd Regiment, 53 Chi-Nus dug in hull down behind earthen berms. The first wave would have met the second within minutes. According to British calculations, each Firefly troop would have expended roughly 200 rounds in the first day's fighting. The casualty projections for both sides were catastrophic. None of it would happen. For those who had built these machines, the atomic revelation felt almost personal. At the Royal Ordnance Factory, Woolwich, engineers studying photographs of Hiroshima realized that the weapons they had perfected were already relics. The 17-pounder, once a masterpiece of kinetic engineering, was a museum piece before its last shipments left the dock. "The future belongs to the physicists," one designer remarked, "not to the gunners." In Japan, the same reckoning arrived in quieter form. Lieutenant General Tsuchiya Shizuya, commander of the 4th Tank Division, submitted his final report to the occupation authorities in September 1945. It concluded with a single line: "Our armour existed for a battle that the heavens forbade." The Chi-Nus were rounded up and towed to depots. American engineers photographed their interiors, measuring armour thickness with micrometers, logging gun dimensions, and noting electrical systems that seemed primitive compared to Allied standards. The verdict: obsolete at manufacture. A few were shipped to the US for testing. Most were cut up for scrap. The Fireflies fared better, but only just. Some went to post-war training units in Germany. Others were sold to Belgium and the Netherlands. By 1951, the last British Fireflies were retired, replaced by Centurions with new 20-pounder guns. The next evolutionary step before the nuclear age made the word tank killer archaic. And yet, despite their obsolescence, both the Firefly and the Chi-Nu became icons, not of victory or defeat, but of the moment before transformation. The Firefly represented industrial triumph, what a desperate democracy could create to counter tyranny. The Chi-Nu represented resolve, what a besieged empire could build with nothing left but faith and steel. They were, each in their own way, the final human arguments before the atom rendered argument moot. When veterans from both nations met decades later, British, Japanese, Australian and Canadian, they sometimes spoke of what might have been. "We would have met in the rice fields," one former Japanese tanker said at the 1985 Pacific Veterans Reunion in Hawaii. You would have destroyed us, but we would have fought, to which a British counterpart replied, "We trained to fight you, and we're grateful we never had to." The Firefly's muzzle flash and the Chi-Nus' defiance belonged to an age that ended in a single morning's light. The duel that never happened stands as a quiet epitaph to industrial war, a reminder that steel once ruled the battlefield, until fire fell from the sky and proved that nothing built by men could ever truly be invincible.